Hey, everybody. My guest today is Professor Sam Director, and we're going to talk about informed consent. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Okay, so you recently wrote a paper on informed consent in the medical context, and I was hoping you could summarize the argument.
Yeah, so maybe just by way of like how I got into this topic, kind of a fun anecdote. And it's the one time in an academic paper I've been able to like kind of diss someone in the acknowledgments. It's not a person, it's a hospital. When my wife and I moved to Rhode Island on like night 5 or so of living there, it was in the first month. We woke up to something strange on our window and it was a bat. And it led to this whole encounter with a bat where, we had to fight this bat out of our bedroom. And it was this whole thing. And I started looking into it. And it's like, oh my gosh, bat bites are imperceptible, even, unless you can trace it from the moment it comes in to the moment it left, which we could not. Assume you've been bitten. And it did touch my wife. Okay, so we go to the hospital. And would you believe, I mean, if you were to guess, how much does rabies immunoglobulin cost for a 6 foot tall male? What would your guess be?
I don't know, 100 to 200 bucks?
So the vaccine itself is quite cheap and you can get it routinely. But I say the word wrong. It's either immunoglobulin or immunoglobulin, which, if I understand correctly, is like blood from people who have been vaccinated for rabies. It is administered based on your weight. And for me, and we didn't have to pay this, our insurance covered it. But for me, I believe it was like $20,000. And for my wife, it was $14,000. And we'd seen before going to the hospital, because we just looked up and we saw all these horror stories of people saying, I got hit with this huge bill after, going in for rabies. And we were thinking, like, should we do this? Like, what if we get hit with this bill and we just didn't know? And we knew the hospital was in network. And, at the end of the day, it was all fine. It cost us our copay. But the point is, it made me think, if someone had just told me, hey, this is going to cost potentially 40 grand, I would have thought twice about getting the shot. And I mean, probably the rational thing to do would still have been to get it because the vaccine is highly effective and, rabies kills 100% of people who get it. But it got me thinking about basically whether informed consent requires knowledge of what the price will be for a medical service. So that's a long way of saying the article that I wrote recently argues that your consent is not sufficiently informed unless you know the cost of a medical service at the time it's administered to you. And the argument's very simple. It's just that you as a patient have a right to know, or doctors have a duty to disclose, whichever way you want to put that, all information that is relevant. And on the plausible understandings of what we mean by relevant, which are a reasonable person understanding, so what a reasonable person would want to know, or a subjective standard of just what in fact you want to know. It seems like knowledge of the price is very relevant. There's no other consumer domain where we go in knowing that the price can range from $10 to $100,000 and we're fine with it, right? We would not go to those businesses. And I want to emphasize this is not the kind of familiar argument that knowledge of price is epistemically useful for people who can then price shop and choose rationally. That's all correct. But what I'm arguing is independent of that. It's saying that you don't know a piece of information that you ought to be able to know if you don't know the price. And it just turns out that in the American medical system, via the way insurance negotiations work, you virtually never know the price going in. And at the beginning of the paper, I summarize an experiment that some researchers ran. I think it was in New England Journal of Medicine, where they called like 100 different hospitals in different states and asked them using a standard script how much a hip replacement would cost for their uninsured grandma. And they got, of the places that could give them a full price, which was not very many. Okay, let me look here. The price varied from $11,000 to $125,000 for the same procedure. And it just seems very relevant to know what that information would be. Okay, so that's the core of the argument. And, one of the major objections is just like, well, what if this is just not feasible? Or what if doctors are just, it's not their responsibility to be a financial counselor? And I have a number of responses to that in the paper, but that's the basic argument that to put it in a flashy way, most patients are being assaulted right now because most patients don't know the price of the service, but they need to know that for their consent to be informed. And surgical procedures or any medical intervention performed without the valid informed consent of the patient is a battery of some kind. And, obviously it's not the same as like doctors performing surgeries forcibly on people. But the point remains that patients are not sufficiently informed in the American medical system, and that this is ultimately compatible with any system where the price is known. So that could be a super free market medicine where supply and demand set the price, or socialized medicine where the price is zero. Both are compatible with what I'm suggesting, and what I'm suggesting is neutral with regard to which of those is correct.
Yeah, I was really happy when I found your paper because this was an idea that I had. And I thought to myself, somebody must have written a paper on this already because it just seems so obvious to me that you can't give informed consent unless you know how much it's going to cost you, right? In addition to it seeming obvious, it also seemed like that it was an insurmountable problem because of however our healthcare system is designed. It's just like, who even knows how much something's going to cost, right? Like, I don't think the doctors know how much something's going to cost, right? Like, you have to probably talk to multiple people on the phone to figure out how much a hip replacement or anything else is going to cost, right? So on the one hand, I feel like the argument is straightforward. You don't know how much it's going to cost, so you can't give informed consent. And so that has a systematic impact on the healthcare system and the ethics of it, right? That seems pretty straightforward. But then it's like, well, maybe it's so impractical to address this issue. This is just what we have to deal with. So because of the practical issues, we I don't know if you want to say that people are giving informed consent, but they are giving a sufficient amount of informed consent given the practical limitations.
Yeah, maybe this kind of gets into some like ideal theory stuff and political philosophy. So yeah, I mean, of course, if you were to ask the average patient, like, do you think your consent is being violated right now? They would, of course, say no. So maybe I'm in a weird way saying that, they're suffering from a kind of false consciousness or something like that. And yeah, I guess it depends on what we think the relationship is between the practical and our obligations. And I think in general, in non-ideal, unjust circumstances, we shouldn't just stop things that benefit people. So take, for example, sweatshop labor or kidney markets. Probably in the perfect, just world, those things would not exist. But there's still some pretty compelling arguments that in the actual world, they help people who are in need, and people would be worse off if we prohibited them. And I think that's a case where you could say, look, in the ideal, such markets would not exist. In the actual, they exist and they benefit people. So I think we could say something similar to medicine without price transparency of like, obviously, patients are better off getting care. The right thing to do is not just stop providing care because it's not sufficiently informed, but that's compatible with, still striving toward the ideal. And I think it's actually less of an ideal than you might think, because it's like not that hard to know what the prices are. And the insurance companies are fully capable of knowing what the price is after the treatment. And it's just, a matter of asking them to do whatever negotiations they have in advance. And, some of this gets caught up in like the weirdness of American health insurance and how you can't pick your insurer really, and how the insurers negotiate and how those prices are set, whatever, right? But like, if there were just a mandate that said you must have some kind of, even like a cost range that's binding, or some kind of searchable index of like what it has cost in the past. I think even that would not be sufficient. Then I think, those things are feasible. And I am vaguely remembering that I think it is like 25 states or so have a price transparency law on the books. It's just not really followed. And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, a lot of hospitals interpret that as just like posting information after the fact about what someone's surgery costs, but you can find, different costs for the same thing at the same hospital. So it's not really that helpful. But generally, I think the fact that it's impractical should show us, yeah, it's not on the doctor, right? They are not any more equipped than you or me. Well, at least not substantially more equipped than you or me to figure out what an insurance company is going to bill for a particular surgery. And it seems like the insurance company is on the hook, or the hospital, for providing that information. And it does, I think, there get into some like tricky stuff about, well, the person who's acquiring your consent is blameless because on place can, and they just can't, in any reasonable sense, figure out what the price is. So I have to appeal to this kind of principle that says if there's some background actor in the domain in which we're discussing who could make your consent informed, then they ought to do so. And, putting my cards on the table, maybe that principle has some problems because it ends up saying something like clerical workers at insurance firms are like actually have the same obligations as doctors in a certain sense because they're involved in the healthcare field. So yeah, I think the obviousness of the argument is there, and then it starts to encounter some problems when you come to, well, who's actually on the hook for providing this information?
Yeah, those are some good points. I think it is kind of important to kind of maybe push back. I think it's important to push back against this concern that it's impractical. You can do it, right? Like you said, insurance companies can figure out what the price is after the fact. They don't have a problem billing you, right? So why couldn't they do that before? At least give a price estimate, right? Like I understand there are certain intricacies that are involved. Like it depends on which doctor was on shift. Maybe it was a doctor that was affiliated with that particular hospital, or it was like another doctor outside who came in, and so that might change the pricing. Like I understand that, right? But you can give a price estimate. And the reason why I think it's not actually that impractical is because I get a price estimate from my dentist.
Oh yeah.
I talk to the dentist, he, gives me a particular recommendation, and I'm like, yeah, okay. And then I go talk to somebody else in the office, right? And then this lady just prints out like the price estimate. Just like, I know what your insurance is. Like, I know how much you spent already, and this is the estimate, and it's almost always correct.
Yeah.
Right. So if the dentist can do that, which is, it's still part of healthcare, but for some reason, the way their insurance is designed, it's not part of our health insurance, right? If the dentist can do that, then why, can't my PCP do that?
Yeah. I mean, to give in a related example, the insurer that I had at the time of the bat incident had a great chat function where you could just immediately get a representative in a text format. And I remember asking them, can you just tell me what this procedure will cost at this hospital? And they said, I can't tell you until I know what the billing code is. And we don't know what the billing code is until the hospital submits it. And it's like, well, surely there should be a standardized, like, are there multiple ways to bill rabies vaccination? What's the deal here? So, yeah, and this is speaking as someone who at the time had a job where I could just essentially take the week off and I was in like the first bit of my postdoc, and emailed my boss and said, hey, I had this bat incident, and I had to listen to a lot of jokes about bats for that year. But other than that, I had the luxury to take the time off and figure all this stuff out. And I also learned as a result of all this blew my mind. Apparently, even if your hospital is in network, the pharmacy might be out of network. So it just so happened in this case that the pharmacy was in network where we got the shots from. But like, what in the world? Had it just happened that at that hospital, the pharmacy had been out of network, I would have had no way to know. Yeah, so maybe there's a related paper to say, like, if this system of in-network, out-network insurance is going to be around for a while, which I'm sure it is, then, like, unless you had a reasonable way to know a provider was out of network, you can't be billed as such or something like that. And maybe there is a law like that. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. Dentists do this. There was a episode years ago on the podcast Econ Talk with Russ Roberts. I'm forgetting the name of the clinic, but where he interviews this doctor who has a clinic, I think in Kansas City, that doesn't accept insurance. And they have on their website where you can just select a part of the body and get a price for a particular procedure for it. And the guy tells the story of being so tired of dealing with insurance, and that he eventually just says, I'm not taking it anymore. And then he's asked by a patient, like, well, what is this going to cost? And he realizes he has never had to think about what the price of a particular service is. So he just kind of like throws out a number, and that's what it costs the patient.
Yeah, I feel like it's ridiculous. At the point that I was making to my colleagues is like, look, can we think of any other area where you buy something but don't know the price, and for some like and then that would be considered informed consent, right? Like imagine like you want to buy a car and you go to the car dealership and the car salesman tells you everything about the car but not the price.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, how do I consent to buying the car? Like I need to know how much the car is going to cost me. Like, yeah, okay, it goes zero to 60 in whatever 3.4 seconds. It has, like this powerful of an engine. It carries this much gas. Okay, yeah. How much does it cost? I don't know. It's like, okay.
Yeah. The one example I can think of is like restaurants where they just say market price for a steak or a fish or something like that. I just don't buy it if I don't know what the price is. But maybe there it's like you could still, if you pressed the waiter, like, hey, what's the range? Are we talking I could get a $10,000 steak bill, or are we talking like max $100? I'm sure they could tell you. And it's just what's happening is there is a price. It's just that they don't want to reprint their menu every night. So I'm sure if you just asked, someone could tell you. Although I guess you could say like, well, what about a case where someone just genuinely says, like, I'm waiving my right to know what the steak is going to cost? I think my view is compatible with that. Because if there were a person who said, I'm waiving my right to know what the medical intervention is going to cost, I would have no problem. That'd be weird, but I'd have no problem with that. It just so happens that I can't think of a person who does, in fact, do that. And the evidence shows very few people are like that. So, yeah, I guess maybe that's a way of rendering the market price restaurant case to be compatible with the medicine case. And also, like, you could say, well, restaurant transactions are far more trivial than medical transactions. So there are a number of differences that you could appeal to. But yeah, other than that, that's the only example I can think of giving informed consent where you, strictly speaking, don't know what the price is.
Yeah, I think waiving your right to know, I think there is room for that. But I agree with you that the vast majority of people are not going to willingly do that. I mean, the only people who don't care about the price, or at least willing to pay any price, are the people who are super rich, right? I don't know those people I don't have those people in my circle, right? The millionaires and the billionaires, right? The other exception is for emergency procedures, right? Like if people would pay anything to not die, right? So I feel like that would also be an exception.
Yeah, that's an interesting case. So, and this is one of the objections people discuss to this idea of like, what if patients, out of concern for price, will not accept, important or life-saving treatment? And the example I give in the paper isn't quite like an emergency medicine case, but it's a person who needs to get a rare cancer treatment. And, it's again, non-ideal circumstances. In the ideal, no one would have to make this trade-off. But in the actual world, given that people do have to make these trade-offs, I think they should be informed. If the person thinks, well, like the options are spend all this money to get a couple more years of life on this experimental cancer treatment, or put that money in an index fund for my child to go to college. I don't know. Like as a non-parent, non-cancer patient, I don't know what I'd do in that situation. It's just not obvious that there's a singular correct decision. Certainly not obvious that giving someone that information is the wrong thing to do. It's only the wrong thing to do if you think it's obvious that pursuing medical interests alone is the most important thing, but that's just clearly not true. We have a number of interests that are worth advancing. And yeah, maybe if it were like a life. Yeah, okay, let's take the rabies case. Because just for any listeners, what you're supposed to do, which we didn't know at the time, if you're ever bitten by a bat, you should keep the bat, capture it, because then they can test it. And if it doesn't have rabies, then you don't need to go through the whole process. Because I had to get 4 shots, and it was because we went to the hospital, we had to keep going back to the hospital. But because we're not at any risk of anything, and it's operating under triage, every time we had to wait like 4 hours to get a 5-minute shot. It was like one of the worst experiences of my life. And where was I going with this? Oh yeah. So say someone has been bitten by a bat. they catch it, it's confirmed to have rabies, and they're told, hey, this is going to cost 80 grand. And they're like, I don't want to do it. And the doctor's like, well, you're going to die if you don't do this. Is that a case where, and suppose telling them the price will make them not do it, but omitting the price will nudge them toward doing it? That's a fringe enough case that I'm confident that doesn't jeopardize the overall thesis. My own kind of radical autonomy view would be, no, just give them the information, make sure they understand what they're doing. And unless you have compelling reason to think that they are not of competent mind, they're allowed to do irrational things. And even though I think it's rational to incur potentially 80 grand of debt to save one's life, maybe not everyone does, and that such decisions should be permitted. But maybe not everyone shares that kind of a radical view. So if you don't, I would be fine with, like, perhaps in some extremely fringe cases, if you know that giving information about price will make someone die, don't give the information about price.
Yeah, even in those cases, I don't think it's right to withhold the information, because it's clear that people care about other stuff besides their own health, right? Parents are willing to die for their kids. That's one of the very few things that people are willing to die for. They're willing to die for their, like, religion, they're willing to die for their country, and they're willing to die for their kids. Okay. Right. And it's not up to the doctor, I don't think, to decide how the patient should make that decision, right? I think the doctor's the doctor's duty is to inform the patient, and so that they can together make the best medical decision for the patient. But there could be other considerations that override that, So I don't think that's problematic.
Yeah, maybe this analogy is not very good, but you could think of, and maybe this is just like playing into some biases, but whatever. I often, in these life and death cases, just think of them in relation to kind of standard religious refusals that we're all intuitively inclined to accept. So if we take the Jehovah's Witness refusing the blood transfusion, what if someone said, look, you just don't tell them you did it. You can save their life. They want to live. But if you tell them that you're going to have to give them a blood transfusion, they're going to say no, and they'll die. That's at least somewhat analogous to the, look, they want to live, but they don't want to pay this money. So just don't tell them about the money. Maybe that's different in some respect I'm missing, but it at least seems like super repugnant in the case of the Jehovah's Witness. But then I think a lot of people are fine with it in the case of the money. And maybe part of what's going on there is that, your religious integrity is a more compelling interest than your financial interests. Yeah, fair enough. But I don't know that makes a substantial enough difference to justify a totally different judgment as to what being informed requires in the situation.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think it's fair to compare people's values like that, right? It's not the doctor's job to decide from an outsider's perspective which value is greater than the other, right? For some people, they would rather, give their kids or grandkids the money than spend it on themselves. I'm like, okay, that's their life, it's their money, right? And it just ties into the patient's right to refuse care, right? Patients have the right to refuse life-saving care. And if one of the reasons is that it's just really expensive, then okay, then that's one of the reasons. I understand the concern because we don't want people to die generally. We want people to make prudentially good choices. But I think it's important for us to remember that, people are willing to sacrifice their own well-being for something that they consider to be a greater value, and that's their call. At least, that's what I think. I'm wondering how much this discussion relates to subsequent consent, because it's something that I've thought about. I wrote a paper on it a number of years ago, and that paper also started with a story. I anonymized it, but it was actually my own story, right? And that's what motivated the paper. Basically, I had suffered a couple of spontaneous pneumothoraxes, so my lung collapsed, right? And so when some people were born, they're born with these bubbles on their lungs. They call them blebs, and throughout their lives, they can sneeze or pick up something heavy or something like that, which will cause one of the blebs to pop, and then so air escapes the lung and goes into the chest cavity, and the lung collapses.
Oh my God!
And so what they have to do is they have to insert a chest tube in between your ribs to let the air out so your lung can reinflate. Okay. Yeah. So that happened a couple of times in 1 week for me. And after the second time, the doctor's like, okay, Now we recommend this surgery where we basically go into your chest and cut out the part of the lung where you have the blebs and then staple it shut. That's what they recommended. And I was like, okay, let's do that. And I was 18 at the time. And after that, they performed what was called a pleurodesis. So a pleurodesis is when they administer some sort of compound into your chest via the chest tube. Well, for me, it was via the chest tube. And it basically makes your lungs stick to like the chest cavity. So it prevents it from recollapsing. So imagine you have two plastic bags and you put one plastic bag into the other plastic bag and you kind of melt them so they become one thicker plastic bag. Okay. That procedure was the most painful thing I've ever experienced in my life, specifically the pleurodesis. Okay. And
Wait,
I
you
asked,
were under anesthesia for this?
no, I was not. Okay. I asked the doctor, is it going to hurt? And he said, I'll give you something for the pain, right? He didn't say yes, but the way that he answered suggested to me that it was going to be painful. Or else why would you give somebody pain medication, right? Most painful thing I've ever experienced. It was bad, really bad. Okay. Like I was screaming. I screamed like, take it out, take it out, and my best friend was sitting in the room and he didn't know what to do. He was just sitting there. And the nurse came back in after, I don't know, some time and like talked to him. He's like, I don't know if you want to be here when he's like that, you know? It was really bad. Okay. And I wouldn't even wish it upon Hitler because that's how painful it was. And I thought about that event because I've like PTSD from it. And it was like, if I had known how painful it was going to be, I don't think I would have consented to it.
Yeah.
Right. But now that it already happened, I'm glad that it happened.
Yeah.
Because my lung hasn't recollapsed. So the question I had that I asked myself was, did I give consent after the fact? Like, can somebody give consent after a procedure and then have that consent work retroactively? Right.
Right.
And so that's what the paper was about. And I'm thinking that this might be a similar situation. Whereas I consent to something and I get the price afterwards and you're like, oh my God, like $20,000 for, a rabies shot. Like if I had known at the time, maybe I wouldn't have, or maybe some other case, some like non-emergency case, but now that it's happened, I'm glad that it did. So maybe I'm giving consent subsequently.
Yeah. It's funny. A colleague of mine just asked me about subsequent consent and I sent him your paper. And then the only other paper I'm aware of is by Eric Schwang. And so as far as I know, the two of you are the only people who've written papers directly on subsequent consent. Maybe there's one I'm missing. Yeah, I guess and when I was in grad school, I took this seminar on consent with David Boonin, and he's pretty sympathetic to the subsequent consent stuff. And I remember having a confusion about like what's doing the work in subsequent consent, if it involves a kind of backward causation of, yeah, like I guess on your view, is it that it was at the time it was not valid consent because it wasn't informed, but looking back, you can say, no, I consented to that. And it's not just like you're realizing that in fact you did consent, it's that you're doing something now that alters the morally relevant facts of the past. Is it the latter?
So I actually don't take a position on that. I say in the paper, like, look, I actually don't know. I don't know if you can give valid subsequent consent, but I argued against relying on it because you're risking violating the patient's autonomy. That was basically my argument. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think Eric's argument, if I remember correctly, is like anything you can say against subsequent consent, you could say against prior consent. And yeah, I like what you just said about the risk, because it also seems like part of the wrong of a consent violation is not just that a wrong was done to you. It's that the person doing it did something that they thought or ought to have thought was wrong. And even if subsequent consent could undo the wrong done to you, it doesn't make it the case that a person acted thinking they didn't have your consent. So like trivial example that comes to mind is you borrow my car and I later tell you, oh yeah, that's fine. I consent to that. It still means maybe no wrong has been done to me, but it still means that you took my stuff without my permission. Like no amount of my subsequent consent is going to alter that because that's just your mental state at the time. So I guess if we think that that's at least part of what's wrong about a consent violation, then I think subsequent consent wouldn't do all the work toward making these things okay. But I also really feel the tension. So like I've also written on anorexia, and there are cases where patients who have anorexia and are force fed will later be thankful that they were force fed. And you could either look at that as a case of subsequent consent or as a case of just some kind of paternalism and just say, like, look, if you have good reason to think that they'll be happy that you made them do it, then just make them do it. And I don't accept the paternalist view. And I'm like pretty skeptical of the subsequent consent view. But I do, that's one of the things that I've thought about where I'm like, I don't know if I got that right. Like maybe there's more to be said about some of these cases of like when you have good reason to think the person will thank you in the future, if there's something other than subsequent consent or paternalism going on. I don't know what it would be, but it's at least a very troubling case of like, this person might die and they might thank me that I didn't let them die, even though right now they're competently saying, let me die.
Yeah, those cases are tricky, but I mean, I can see that in a whole bunch of different scenarios. Like it's not going to be necessarily treatment dependent, right? And the reason why is because people change their values over time, you know, and that's fine. Maybe somebody was willing to die for their country when they were 19, but then now when you ask them when they're 35, they're no longer willing to do that, and they're grateful that they're alive now, right? So I don't know if that's the way to go about it. I mean, I think you would have a stronger case if you could give some sort of statistical evidence that, oh, when we purposefully save Jehovah's Witnesses lives by giving them blood transfusions, 60% of them are grateful that we did it, right? And that would be better evidence. But then that's still, like I still feel that there's danger there because you can't apply that to that particular individual.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. I was trying to think, you mentioned something, made me think of an example. Yeah. Maybe if you had like a crystal ball and you had a time, a comprehensive view of, what people's actual values will end up being over the course of their whole life, you could maybe paternalism would be more on the table if I just knew what you really cared about, not just now, but at all points in the future. But even, well, maybe that's a very radical position. I'm inclined toward a view that says even if I had comprehensive knowledge that what you want now will not be what you want in 5 minutes, I'm still not licensed to act paternalistically toward you. That's perhaps radical in some respects, but yeah, I guess linking back to price transparency, if it's like patients would be like, I'm happy I wasn't told the price because it would have deterred me from getting the thing, but it is really good that I got the procedure and this debt is payable, or it just meant I couldn't go on that vacation, but I didn't really need to go on that vacation or something like that. Yeah, I mean, but the alternative is like, what about someone who is in that 40% of people who are not grateful? And like you said, that they're not, they're an individual, and treating them like a statistic is not respecting their autonomy. And medicine is in the business of respecting autonomy, even if, it doesn't lead to the best outcome.
Yeah, these are definitely tricky issues. Also, when it comes to the pricing, the choices are not necessarily consent to this procedure versus just not getting the procedure at all, right? It's consent to getting this procedure here at this hospital versus another hospital, right? I think that is more likely.
Yeah, so there I think we're back in the kind of price shopping point, which is totally accurate. And it is funny to me when people say that America is a market-based healthcare system, because there are elements of it that are, but like what markets have no prices? And like the core, at least when you talk to some kind of free market folks, the price system is like what they think makes markets work. And if you were to take that out, then obviously it doesn't work very well. Yeah, so if patients could pick, where they want to get it, the bargaining power of voting with your feet of, well, I'm just not going to this hospital that charges this stupid rate would, inevitably have an effect. I mean, maybe some of this goes back to the practicality of you can only price shop so much when you have the same insurance provider. Like if you go back to the level of who your provider is, you have two, usually, one company, two versions. At least in my adult life, every employer I've worked for has one or two insurance firms you can contract with, and a high deductible plan and a no deductible PPO plan or whatever it's called. And it's like, well, unless those insurers have like radically different prices from hospital to hospital, which maybe they do, the price shopping point kind of gets harder to see. So maybe truly letting patients use price discrimination to choose what they think is best requires some kind of non-employer offered insurance system. I was talking with a colleague about this yesterday. I was under the impression that the origin of employer provided health insurance was that in the Great Depression, the FDR administration had a wage freeze, and basically that firms to compete for laborers had to offer fringe benefits. I'd always been told that, but maybe that's wrong, because someone said to me yesterday it also has to do with income tax, where employers were incentivized to give you non-taxable benefits rather than taxable income because of ways that the tax law is set up. But it was illuminating to me that this like health insurance through your employer system we have is not at all a natural thing. It's a very artificial result of very old legal actions people took in like the 40s or 30s or whatever. And yeah, I mean, wouldn't it be great if we had some kind of voucher system, or if your employer just paid you in cash? Like if you look at what these insurance plans cost for the year for the employer, it's not cheap. And if I just got that money in cash, I would, be able to pick the plan that I want, and that would be great.
Yeah. Another distinction that I think is important here between like healthcare and like other products is that you can't get a refund, right? Like if I buy something off of Amazon and I don't know the price, I could at least return it and get my money back. But if you get the vaccine, it's not like they can take the vaccine back and you'll get your $10,000, right? So it's like, you don't know how much it's going to cost and there are no refunds. And it's like, okay, like why would I consent to that unless I'm like dying?
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. It's irreversible in many respects. I mean, I guess like what's that movie? I never saw it, but the movie where like the guys, their job is to repossess the organs that people have
Yeah, it's like
missed.
Repo Man or Repo Men or something like that. Yeah, it's like, yeah, just take the kidney back. I'd rather have the 25 grand. It's like, I don't, I don't think it works like that, man. I feel like the main reason why this is so important is one, the extent of it, but two, because healthcare costs are so expensive, right? If we were talking about relatively cheap procedures, I feel like the violation of people's consent or informed consent would be minimal. But if we're talking about, a hip replacement, which could cost, $100,000, that is a big deal, right? People will go bankrupt because of these bills.
Yeah. And one idea that some people have brought up is like, because I guess there's this long history of saying, well, the reason that patients aren't entitled to this information is that informed consent is just about medical information, and financial information is not medical information. Some people have tried to make the move that, well, actually, financial information is medical information in the sense that there can be side effects of getting a big bill. And they'll try to argue, and I guess there's some evidence for this, that there are physical effects for getting a huge bill, anxiety, stress, obviously, and this can lead to worse health outcomes, so that it's not as simple as, well, price is just not a feature of medical information. And again, to all the points you've made of like what other market operates this way, where it's like you're buying a TV and they tell you, well, I didn't tell you the price because that was not information about the TV. I only tell clients information about the TV and its function and how well it will work for them. I don't, you don't need to know this non-TV related information. And yeah, because I think America has like a really high rate of medical bankruptcy. And I know I think it was in the 2020s, or no, before 2020, but like the No Surprise Bill Act. I don't fully understand what's involved with it, but I think it's something like you can't get a surprise bill after a certain number of days, so that if hospitals don't bill you within a certain time window, they can't. Oh, and by the way, I think this hospital in Rhode Island still owes me money because there was a case where they overbilled us, and it was like we called them a gajillion times, waited on hold, and I think they still owe us like $100. So in the acknowledgments, I thanked the Roger Williams Medical Center for their great care, all the quality service they provided us in that moment.
I think it'd be useful to kind of go over this reasonable person standard when it comes to consent and perhaps contrast it with like other accounts. Could you summarize it?
Yeah, so going back to Beecham and Childress and their influential medical ethics textbook, they have these three standards for what informed consent requires in terms of information. And they're all trying to get at this idea of like, what are the things you need to know for your consent to be sufficiently informed? I like to think of it, borrowing a term from Tom Dougherty in a different context, not in medical consent, but in sexual consent, about these things as deal breakers, that they are counterfactuals of the form, if I knew X, I would not have given my consent, or unless I know Y, I will not give my consent. And one of them is the professional practice standard, which just every time I hear people talk about it, it sounds so odd to me. If I understand it correctly, it's just saying, well, what patients have a right to know is what is common in the healthcare field to inform them of. And that sounds like an obvious non-starter, so I don't really consider it. And then the reasonable person standard and the subjective standard. So reasonable person standard just being, well, patients have a right to know or ought to be informed about what a reasonable person in their circumstances would want to know. And I mean, the law is just full of these reasonable person standard principles. And in the context of, I've not seen it critiqued as much in the context of medicine. I've definitely seen it critiqued in the context of sexual assault law, where people say that the notion of the reasonable person, often stated as the reasonable man, carries with it a lot of sexist assumptions, and that it, is not, there's no obvious conception of what reasonability is. I'm sympathetic to that. I think, a lot of the cases that we've been discussing are just cases where, to me, it doesn't seem reasonable to forego a life-saving blood transfusion for my integrity with a God of the Jehovah's Witness that I don't think exists. But to them, it does seem reasonable. So if what reasonable means is like you endorse a certain range of like correct beliefs, then obviously that's not the standard we should be using. If what reasonable means is just like you're a good Bayesian and your priors and your goals are like matched by your practical action, then like tons of stuff is going to be reasonable. So if that's what's meant, then I'm fine with that. And then finally, the subjective standard is just that what you need to know is just in fact what you would say you need to know. So this is, perhaps overbroad. If I say, look, I need to know the length of the fingernails of my doctor for my consent to be informed, according to an extreme version of that standard, then you ought to be informed about the length of the doctor's fingernails. I am pulling up this quotation where Beecham and Childress have a way of limiting this. So what they say is they have a way of saying like, oh, it's like not everything a patient would want to know. It's like some reasonable mix. So they kind of like bring the reasonable person standard in on the back end. Oh yeah, here it is. So what Beecham and Childress say is the physician is obligated to disclose the information a particular patient needs to know if the physician could reasonably be expected to know the patient's informational needs. So yeah, they do kind of build the reasonable person standard in on the background. And yeah, maybe there's something to be said for like doctors are blameless for preferences that are not stated, and you don't have a good reason to think in general that your patients will care about the length of your fingernails when you perform the surgery. But also I could see a case to be made for like, look, that's an uncommon preference, but if someone states that, and that's a condition of your interacting with their sphere of autonomy, then yeah, I mean, what does that say about us that our reaction is like, oh, the things we don't agree with, that people have preferences about, those don't matter. I agree it is odd. And, were someone my patient, I would probably say, that's not very feasible. I can't really do that. And if that's a condition for you, let me find you another surgeon. But, simply having weird preferences doesn't mean that you are, not deserving of autonomy. But I think you could limit it by saying, but it's not like doctors have to give you a questionnaire for every possible thing that you might have a preference about. Do you want the surgery to be in an even numbered room or an odd numbered room? They could say, like, look, if it matters to the patient, they'll make it known to us, and and so forth. And yeah, so basically, it just turns out, as we've discussed, that any reasonable consumer wants to know the price. I don't think it's a big leap to say, there are problems with reasonable person standards, but we can all agree that most consumers who are reasonable would want to know the price of service. And then when you look at empirical data, people have found about what consumers want about price transparency. So just pulling up this part of the paper, in a study of 220 patients, 81.4% either strongly agreed or agreed with preferring that their physician talk with them about out-of-pocket costs before beginning treatment, and 92% wanted to know their out-of-pocket costs before beginning treatment. And wow, and even in a study with cancer patients, 80% wanted to know the information, but 72% responded that no healthcare professional has ever discussed costs with them. So basically, patients do in fact want to know the cost. So it seems like whichever of those standards is correct, price transparency is going to come out as something that patients have a right to know.
Anytime I hear that word reasonable person or just, reasonable, I always ask what that means. Because I'm not entirely sure how to answer that question myself. Like, what would a reasonable person want to know or need to know in this situation in order to give informed consent? It's like, I think price belongs there. Like it seems obvious to me because, like money is limited, right? And you're going to have to, weigh the pros and cons of spending money here versus spending money over there. And it just seems that would be part of most people's lives, but if you were to push me on that and ask, okay, but why would a reasonable person need to know that? I wouldn't be able to give an answer, right? I would maybe try to point to the fact that I think I suspect most people would need to know that, but then I don't want to conflate the majority with what's reasonable, like, how do you kind of work through that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think I have a super worked out view. I think probably what is meant historically by these reasonable person standards is some kind of, well, yeah, I don't know if it's meant to be a content neutral or just like a procedural account of reasonability. And, and by that, what I mean is it saying there are just certain views or beliefs that no matter how much evidence you have, you can never reasonably hold them? Or is it just saying, no, you could have flat earth beliefs and be reasonable as long as you'd only ever been exposed to images of the flat earth and had been raised to believe that all the round earth folks were conspiracists and so forth? I think, yeah, what we mean by reasonable, I think, is probably the latter, that given the information you have, the conclusions you draw, or the premise of your practical syllogism is going to achieve your ends, or you're believing in proportion to your evidence or something like that. If what's meant by reasonable is just you believe correctly, then, that's one way to define it, but it would just have the implication that probably most people are not reasonable. And maybe there's a helpful analogy to the philosophy of religion literature where theist philosophers are at pains to say there's a distinction between showing that one's view is reasonable and proving that one's view is correct. And, like in the problem of evil, often folks will say, look, I'm not in the business of proving to someone with beyond a shadow of a doubt that my view is correct, but I am in the business of proving to someone, given the information and the evidence I have in my priors, this conclusion that, a just God is compatible with evil is not something that like a crazy person would think. It's something that a smart person, given this evidence, would conclude. So I think that's got to be what's meant by reasonable. And then I guess, are we in a situation where like most of what people do is reasonable because most people are okay at being practically rational? Yeah, I guess if you had a case where someone, I don't know of a religion that preaches this, but say that someone's religion said taking blood transfusions is totally fine. And someone came in and said, hey, my religion says it's against the rules to take a blood transfusion. I'd prefer to die. And you point out to them, look, like here is the text from your religion that says blood transfusions are fine. And they say, I don't believe it. And it's quite clear to you that their stated reason for why they're refusing it is that they think their religion forbids it, but you just know that they're factually wrong. Yeah, that's a hard case. I
That's
mean,
tricky.
yeah, reasonable person standard would say, I think, that you could coerce them in that situation.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely tricky. This relates to like a whole bunch of other medical ethics questions, like, whether or not this patient is delusional, right? Because if they're saying something that's, prove that you can prove that's false, right? That maybe I'm willing to grant that this person is delusional, but a lot of religious claims or spiritual claims are not falsifiable like that, right? They'll say, oh, it's a sin. And it's like, okay, well, I mean, like, it's not really our job to kind of disprove that or show that that's false, because then we're judging the person's spiritual beliefs. You know what I mean? But if they're making a claim about something that's empirically false, right? Like they're saying they're not pregnant. It's like, no, no, you're pregnant, right? Then we can say that the patient has a false belief, you know? But yeah, it's tricky. The price stuff, though, like, I feel like the moral argument is there. Like, I completely agree with your paper. I just don't know if it's ever going to change. It's interesting. Like, I feel like philosophy sometimes, encounters a number of different problems, right? And one common problem is that philosophers will work on stuff that just aren't really relevant. And then sometimes philosophy works on such fundamental issues that our society is just unwilling to change due to whatever force, like due to whatever reasons. And I feel like your paper falls in that category. Like it's obviously true, but I just don't ever seeing it like implemented, you know?
Yeah, that'd be sad. I mean, there have been some, I was doing a bit of Googling to catch myself up on the recent laws this morning. There have been some recent laws, it looks like, about price transparency. I don't know. I'm just not an expert on like how insurance firms work, so I don't know if it actually would achieve its effect if, say, the state of Virginia mandated that hospitals need to post prices. Simply mandating that can't change. Well, the hospital also can't know the price until they've talked to the insurer, and the insurer is not. Well, I guess they are bound by the laws of the state of Virginia if they're operating in Virginia. Yeah. So maybe it's one of those things where it's like there's so many different actors involved, you'd have to regulate and change the way they do things that it's just not going to happen. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I am young enough that I remember the Affordable Care Act was, well, how old was I? I think I was a junior in high school when the Affordable Care Act passed. And I remember even at the time thinking like, oh, this is like asking Americans to do something that is like so foreign to them and it's just not going to have uptake among people. And I think that at least partially turned out to be correct, whatever one thinks of the ACA. And yeah, I guess that'd be sad. But I'm inclined to think it's something that's so easily solvable. If you just got like a president who was like, oh, this is really important, and just said, like, we're going to make this a priority. But yeah, maybe a lot of other issues are like this too. Like, so my own view is that we should have open borders or relatively open borders. And I think it's quite obvious that we should, well, not obvious, but I think it's a compelling case that we should. And there's an easy policy solution. Just open the border, right? But that requires that Americans like, it either requires that we have a president who does something fundamentally undemocratic because most Americans are not in favor of open borders, or it requires a substantial change in like the attitudes of 300 million people toward immigrants, which is also not going to happen. So maybe it's analogous to a case like that.
Yeah, yeah, it's highly relevant, but very impractical. Like maybe like I feel like only a few arguments of philosophy will fall in that nice little Venn diagram where it's relevant and it's practical, where that change can easily happen. Anyway, I think it's a good place to wrap things up. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was really fun.